Up next, we have Hector Monsegur and Nelson Santos chatting about how adversaries view your attack surface. Guys, why don't you introduce yourselves?
Hi, my name is Nelson Santos. I'm a principal sales engineer here at Pentera. In my past life, I worked as a pen tester on blue teams, red teams, purple teams, all colors. And today, I have someone with me that I actually admired a lot in the past. I'm sure you heard his name if you're old school like me. But Hector, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Nelson. It's a pleasure. My name is Hector Monsegur, Director of Research at Reconnaissance. I'm still very much on the offensive side, pen testing, red team work, purple teaming, and so on. Emulation and simulation. I mean, you name it, I'm there. I'm involved. Former Black Hat, in my previous life. And for the most part, I spent most of my life in cybersecurity in some capacity. So I'm glad to be here, Nelson, and thank you.
No, thank you for being here. And Hector agreed to talk to us a little bit about what the hackers are looking for when they're looking at your attack surface and your security. As I said, he has a lot of experience in this area. So I think maybe we'll start by talking a little bit about the past, right? Or what I guess what the adversary looked like in the past and how that has evolved to what we're seeing today.
Oh yeah, that's a fascinating question for me because I usually label myself an unofficial hacker historian, just because I've been around and I've seen a lot of different things and different patterns. I would say that groups in the past, threat actors in the past, differ greatly than today. Since we did not have cryptocurrency back in the 90s that was easily accessible or readily accessible, or even for part of the 2000s, crimes that involved money were much harder to deal with. I mean, you would more than likely see ATM skimmers and credit card scams taking place, and then those cards would be sold online, and that would be the brunt of it for the most part. You would also have things like intellectual property theft. Well, that was very big as well, and that would happen. And that would really come from a specific set of countries, without really naming any. But that was kind of like the big thing during that time frame. But for the most part, attackers themselves have been slowly evolving. There was a point where you would have these separate groups that would do, let's say, security research, identify vulnerabilities, and then create exploits for those vulnerabilities. And they would either share with their friends or keep the exploits for a long time. So at some point, you would have groups that had an entire arsenal of 0 days for vulnerabilities that the industry did not even know existed. Now it's different. As soon as you identify vulnerability now, that vulnerability equals money. And so you can either sell it to, an exploit broker. You could try to, report it ethically to the vendor. But in many cases, those two steps are skipped and they're just sold directly to bad actors. Now, those bad actors would take advantage of those exploits for all sorts of scenarios, okay? In furtherance, in either gating cryptocurrency or payments, or even using it for, nation-state actor engagements, okay? Now, once we got to that point, once we saw that the weaponization and the selling of exploits became a problem, now, once ransomware took off, see, it's a combination of different things. You take ransomware, you take cryptocurrency, you take I would say the commercialization of exploits and vulnerabilities, and now you have what we have today, which is the use of a very effective tool, social engineering, to get access or initial entry access to a corporate environment, where then ransomware will be engaged.
The other thing too that I noticed, right? It's in the past, it was there were a lot fewer hackers, right? I mean, you had to learn everything from scratch. There weren't documentation, the exploitation frameworks didn't exist, right? Exploitability didn't exist, so it was hard. You had to learn the basics to be able to even get started on the field. But nowadays we see there's a lot more people, there's a lot more, as I said, organized, right? There's different things. So talk about a little bit about like maybe that part, like the number of people doing it, or the resources now that are available to these bad actors. And
Yeah, no, I mean, look at how let's use me as an example, okay, if you don't mind. When I got online in 1995, what I was faced with, aside from, I'm not sure if you guys remember, the internet back in those days was kind of like the Wild West. Um, very low moderation on pretty much anything. Now, with that being said, there wasn't a try hack me, right? There wasn't a learning platform where you could sit there and read through documentation or read through a tutorial, go to YouTube and like watch a video and then retrace your steps. No, what we had back in those days were e-zines or electronic magazines. And inside those e-zines, you would have article, how to operate Unix, how to hack into this, how to stack, smash the stack for, yeah, right? For fun and profit. That's all you had. In order for you to learn to hack, you eventually, or rather essentially, you had to hack to learn. And that's a good quote from a friend, Drew Logic. But yes, that was kind of how you learned how to hack in those days. Now, if you were a student in universities, depending on the school that you went to, you had resources and you could experiment depending on what kind of programs were available to you. Okay. When we look at a lot of these different hacker groups and their modus operandi and their methodologies, and this is not me judging them, okay? Some groups are very sophisticated, which means they've probably been around as long as you and I have, okay? But some of the groups are not. In fact, most of the groups are not. And their methodology is very much aligned to someone that's kind of been doing this for maybe 2 years, right? What some may call script kiddies, I call it neophytes, right? These are people that probably have not been in security for too long and have learned enough using YouTube and public forums to get to where they are in terms of ransomware. And it's fascinating to see. And my sadness from that, right? What I take from that is that I wish they knew if they would have meet someone like you, Nelson, or someone like me, or any of the great researchers at Pentera, and just poke their minds, speak for 5 minutes and kind of get some insights, it would spark a wonderful career path. And there's a lot of opportunities right now. So yes, I'm hoping that even conversations like this, Nelson, hopefully you could change one of those minds and say, you know what, I'm gonna go work for Pentera instead.
Yeah. That's a great point. And with so many, the education, everything, it's so easy right now. Like we see there are majors in universities on cybersecurity. There are masters in cybersecurity. So it's very different from where we were back then, but it's a lot more focused. So it does give you that opportunity if you have the, that's awesome. But so let's talk a bit more maybe about the present now. So in your experience, I mean, in current experience, you've been working in security for a long time now. What is the current adversary looks like, or their playbook, right, or what they're looking for when they're preparing and executing an attack?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating to me because I have to constantly, excuse me, I have to constantly read up on incident response reports. I have to look at, public research papers that come out on different attack groups. InfoSec Twitter helps out a lot with that research. The reason why I have to kind of absorb that is because I want to learn what the methodologies are. Have they changed? What kind of tools are being used? And what exactly are threat actors doing once they get into an internal network? Okay. Can I, as a researcher or red teamer, take advantage of any of these tools to improve my own work, or can I improve the methodology that these guys are using, and then simulate? For example, let's say a lockbit attack. Okay, if we were to look at like a lockbit attack, and we see that they have a specific set of methodologies or different commands or different procedures and tactics that they use, well, I'll have a customer come to me and say, hey, so how do we fare against this group? Or how do we fare against these kind of groups? And so by learning that stuff, I'm able to kind of replicate, simulate, replicate, then simulate or emulate. And it's fascinating to see the kind of the groups that are out there. A lot of them are not sophisticated, okay? But they're effective. Now, why are they effective if they're not sophisticated? Well, they're effective because they're doing what they know works, right? Social engineering works. Now, if your victims are not clicking on emails, so send them an SMS message. That works even better. You try to replicate what works. And, it's interesting to see that. Now, there's another set of group, or rather another set of actors that we should probably be talking about as well. The last year or the year before, it was within the last 2 years, you had a campaign against a large number of large companies that were successful, and very little hacking took place, right? We're talking about the Lapsus group. So with money and cryptocurrency, rather, they were able to purchase cookies and credentials from employees that were compromised along the way, along the chain, okay? And now this Lapsus group that had very little hacking experience, all of a sudden were hacking Fortune 500 companies. And they were doing so publicly. Now, those guys were arrested. That's why we could talk about that. But the reality is that there is a spectrum, okay? And I would say that if I were to estimate, and I could be wrong, I would love to hear your numbers as well. If I were to estimate, I would say that less than 20% of the actors out there are very highly sophisticated, like legitimate hackers. And then, 80% plus, right, are pretty much neophytes that have access to tools or have access to money, okay? And there's one point I want to make on that. With all the recent tech layoffs all across the planet, we have hundreds of thousands of employees with tech knowledge that are being laid off from their jobs. All it would take is a quarter of a Bitcoin to probably leverage or sway one of these individuals to give up information about the infrastructure, to give up information about their cookies, authentication, endpoints, and potentially credentials. So yeah, that's where we're at today.
That's a really interesting point. The with the layoffs and the insider threat, right? We always hear about that. And the other thing too, you made I think an amazing point that this is what I infer from it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people worry about the very sophisticated attacks, right? Oh, the nation states that are going to get into me and reach my network. And red teams, rightly so, are worried about those guys. But most of the time, that's not what gets these companies. Not the sophisticated attack. It's because, as I said, the attackers, it's about the volume, right? If they can, it's easy now. They have the resources, and with the internet, made so easy, it's just we can just deploy these attacks in a huge volume. And if one person clicks on it, if one person, there's a little chink in the mail, that's enough for you to get in and perform the attack. So I think that's a really cool point. In terms of methodology. And again, without putting you on the spot, but if you were, on their shoes, what would you go through, to in terms of reconnaissance and that kind of stuff, and the methodology basically that you would use to evaluate and perhaps attack a company?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that, a lot of researchers, when you look at like an OWASP top 10, you kind of have a direction as to which categories to focus on. When you look at some of the researchers' external methodologies, sometimes they differ very much. Most of it should be the same researcher to researcher, but I've always caught different gaps whenever I see someone post a methodology or do like a write-up on an engagement or a pen test they've done. So here's what attackers are using today. Like, let's go to the base, and whatever is extra we can figure out. But the base of what actors are doing, they will use search engines like Shodan and others. There's a Chinese one that's really popular as well. And these search engines pretty much scan the internet all day, every day, and they're constantly updating the database. So if you're a bad actor and you don't want to spend time on resources, or you want to spend time waiting for scan results, you could just scan Shodan all day continuously, every 5 minutes, every hour, okay? Until your license gets expired or revoked. But that's the easy mode, okay? They would also use Google and other search engines for deep web searches, looking for endpoints that, for the most part, a normal user would not see, okay? And those would probably get caught up in a deep crawl across, a web application. Okay, cool. But here's where it gets a little interesting. Attackers have set up essentially servers that sit there at some place in some data center, and it continuously enumerates DNS for their targets over and over and over. As soon as a developer at an organization deploys a new WordPress instance, okay? And they set up a DNS record, and they set up HTTPS, an SSL certificate. Within the hour, the attacker is going to see that. It's already online. They got the DNS records. They know where it points to. Oh, there's a brand new WordPress installation. Can we take it over prior to the developer finishing installation? Okay. Now, let's go beyond that. DNS enumeration it can be noisy. So the next best thing for an attacker right now is to connect directly to the transparency log, right? And some call it the Google transparency log. Others call it the certificate transparency log, okay? And it's basically a waterfall of certificates. They're constantly being generated. They're constantly being seen by browsers or services, and then they're uploaded to a massive database that was started by Google, and I'm not sure who runs it now, but it's called the CTL. I'm not sure if you ever connected to the CTL and kind of just sat there and listened. It is insane because what you're getting are SSL certificates literally seconds after they're first seen or they're first deployed. And depending on the service, it'll report it upstream, and then CTL would add it to its database. It's basically like trying to collect the water from the ocean. Okay? Now, what does that mean for an attacker? What that means is that even faster than DNS enumeration, and this is passive, it's not active, they're able to passively listen for brand new SSL certificates for their target victims. And because of that, because certificates have a main name, right, a subject name, but they also have alternate names. And depending on how the certificate is deployed, if a developer puts in, let's say, a large series of internal host names in there, now you have an information leak. Now the attackers know what to look for in the event they get inside the internal network. Okay. So now we're looking at DNS enumeration. We're looking at search engines. We're looking at SSL certificate kind of monitoring. The next stage for the adversary is scanning, right? They're going to scan through assets. They're going to scan through GitHub. They're going to go through Pastebin. They're going to go to every resource available to them to find any information leak that'll provide them some sort of leverage against their victim. You put all of that information together, and you essentially have a dossier on your target. And it's extremely effective. And in terms of time cost, we're talking about hours to compromise a multi-billion-dollar business. Because somewhere, at some point in time, all it took was one developer to make one misconfiguration that has been overlooked all these years, and then an adversary finds it, and they're going to leverage it. So, yeah, that's kind of where we are today.
I think that's amazing. I mean, I'm sure you remember when we had to set up our 33600 modems and then run an Nmap. It took hours to get a couple of hosts. And nowadays, you're talking about massive information gathering in a few hours. And I think it's also makes it harder for people to protect their infrastructure because of all the DevOps revolution, right? With the introduction of not only DevOps tools, but cloud providers like AWS, Azure, and everything. They're amazingly, they're great at making life easier to deploy these things. But in the past, everyone knew what they were deploying because you had to buy a server, you had to put it somewhere, physically put it somewhere, connected to the internet. Now, a developer with access to the to the AWS console or Azure console or GCP console can just create a new instance, and put it on the network. And the other thing too is sometimes bypassing other security controls, because for one thing, it's new technology and it's relatively complex, right? The whole idea of IAM and roles and these things is very different from what we had in the past. So, what is your opinion on that side? Both the rise of DevOps and making it easier to deploy these things, and just cloud in general, cloud infrastructure.
Well, there's always been a controversial question. Do we want to store our data on someone else's computer? Right? That's what the cloud is. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it depends. It depends on a lot of factors. Now, if you would have asked me that question 20 years ago, I would be like, no, Nelson, are you crazy? No, I would not do that. But even I use Google Cloud for research. I use AWS for some client stuff here and there. It all depends on how you use it and how you configure it and how you're deploying. Deployment, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, is extremely important. This is why there's some companies, some of your clients, some of mine, who actually end up hiring DevOps Sec engineers. And this is probably one of the highest paid positions in cybersecurity, aside from like a CISO or something. Okay. So my personal opinion on this is I'm definitely for the cloud. I think the cloud works fine. It's okay. I would say that the deployment process that we have now and all the different tools that we have are fantastic. Okay. But here's my warning. It's very easy to make a mistake during that entire process. It's extremely easy to misconfigure some sort of service or some sort of access control, where all of a sudden all of your data are exposed to anyone that requests it. And all it takes is one policy change, just one. So yes, be aware and bring the right people on staff to kind of help you with that process.
Now, I think that's really interesting. And not cool, but interesting thing is that it's a convergence of two forces that I think, we're talking about huge volume. So we have a huge volume of resources for the bad actors. And now, there's an increase also on the volume of targets, right, on the surface, because now you can create these things. And it's a lot easier to do it. So I think both things together, they do mean that at some point you are going to run into a misconfiguration, into a forgotten server, leak credentials, something like that. So what about like team organization?
Well, it all depends kind of what we're talking about. And I'll give you some examples here, right? So back in the days, what you was referencing, we had Cult of Dead Cow, we had Loft Industries, Team Teso, and we had the Last Stage of Delirium out of Poland. All smart people, incredible. Researchers, fantastic. During my time, we had LulzSec and Anonymous and those things, right? Those different kind of groups. And those groups were specific to hacktivism and in some cases, exfiltration of emails. In terms of methodology and organization, it didn't really matter, which is why I think those kind of groups were hit hardest by law enforcement, because their operational and personal security weren't great, including my own. And I'm actually glad that my personal security wasn't great. But now you have these groups now. You fast forward to 2023. Most of the groups that you're probably referencing are ransomware groups, or criminal syndicates or whatever, right? They're criminals at the end of the day. And so their goal is to monetize their capabilities. Okay. Yeah, you can run a ransomware by yourself. You might get some money, you may not. You may get some cryptocurrency, you may not. Now, what if you create the infrastructure and you put and you give anybody the capability, anybody that has the capability to send an email to now use your platform, your infrastructure to potentially bring money in. And all you do is take a PC out of it, right? Percentage. Some groups, aside from those that operate ransomware as a service platforms, some groups are pretty much like an organized crime organization, right? Or some sort of crime organization where they have leadership, they have structure, they have technical support. The groups nowadays are really focused on the financial gain. It is very much different than it was 20-something years ago when you had groups in it for the research.
Now, I think that's very interesting. So from the organization side, so now going to the other side of the fence, right? So what do you think, I mean, we talk about having more resources, right? But how do you think that a company can, protect itself? And I don't mean just, tools and that kind of stuff, but more as a philosophy or a way to approach this problem of cybersecurity and this growth in attack surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things I always tell clients is, look, we have to be proactive about our security measures. Cybersecurity or security in general needs to be part of your everyday mentality. It is a mental thing. The same way you're going to protect your business physically. You have gates up and you have bars in your windows and you have an armed security guard. These are the kind of things that you want to be looking at for your network and for your data. Whether it's tools, whether it's access controls, whether it's policy, you want to take advantage of every resource available to you, starting with like the simplest, a checklist, an assessment, right? A risk assessment, a threat assessment. What's the worst case scenario if we get compromised today? What's going to happen to our business? Is, Mary or Joe going to lose their job if there's a ransomware attack? How can we prevent that? So now you start to slowly head into defense in depth, where you're targeting all areas of your organization, not only physical, but you're looking at external. What do we do with the external side? Who's controlling DNS? Who's deploying our applications? Who's hosting our applications? Well, we need to think about this. Let's talk to our security engineers. Let's talk to our head developer. Okay, those conversations are meaningful. Eventually, you're going to get enough information about your organization from the outside that you're going to start to have concerns. Now, once you have concerns, you could use a tool or you could use a security team to come in, right? But my recommendation, and this goes for everybody here, the reason why you have continuous tools that do continuous assessments or validation, and very obvious here, is that we want to move away from point-in-time assessments, right? If you do one pen test a year, it's not really going to mean much 3 weeks after the fact, because vulnerabilities and attack paths and attack vectors and modus operandi of organizations, bad actors, constantly change. Okay? So we want to move away from that. We want to kind of look at continuous validation, continuous testing, to kind of see where we stand throughout the year rather than once a year. Okay? And aside from being proactive, aside from being preemptive, aside from including security into our everyday hygiene, working on policies and knowing who to call in the event of a compromise, and of course, aside from the continuous testing and validation, then there's the final step, right? There's more steps, but I'll leave you with one last point. How do we deal with the worst case scenario, and how do we deal with recovery? You can have all the policies in the world, but all it takes is one insider threat. All it takes is one open email and link click to bring down your organization. Okay, it happens. We're all human. Well, how fast can we recover? Are we talking about 72 hours? Or are we talking about 6 months? And that's the difference between having a successful security program and losing your business.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I've seen a lot of success, as you said, with automation in everything, right? I mean, we were talking about DevOps, right? There's automation of the deployment of these things. And automation of security testing and their security control is certainly important. But of course, having those specialists, people that can do the sophisticated stuff, can look at your security controls like Renact can, and make an evaluation of now that you're doing all these things, let's get the human component in, right? The creativity that's also necessary for these attacks. And I think that's the winning combination, right? It's combining the two to make sure that you're always on top of these things. Because again, as you said, right, if you do a pen test once a year, it can be the best pen tester in the world, but you're going to be fixing problems, for the rest of the year. But the next week, there are new servers on your network. There's new exposure out there. So it's just an ever-changing environment. So being resilient is important. Cool. So in terms of the automation, on just jumping back now to the attacker side, are you seeing a change in that, in more automation from the attacker side of things as well? Because we talk a lot about sophisticated tools, on the for us, and we talk about individual attacks that sound very sophisticated. But what about just the stuff that requires repetition, right? Are you seeing a lot of automation?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I've been seeing a lot of automation since the early 2000s, when we had Code Red almost shut down the internet. And then we had, all sorts of different worms and scanners. So let's focus on that for now. Then we kind of go into, exploitation, ransomware, et cetera, et cetera. So scanning happens literally every millisecond of the day. The moment you connect your laptop directly to the internet, you're going to start to see firewall hits. You're going to start to see traffic coming into your network, either SSH or FTP or your web servers, or something is being scanned by somebody. It's either going to be a researcher, sorry, or it's somebody's bot. Okay.
Yep.
And like I said, this is happening all day, every day. So this is to be expected. Now, that's automation. It's dumb automation, but it's automation nonetheless. Now the attacker has to actually do some manual work, okay? Because not every endpoint is the same. Even if you have two endpoints that both have Defender and they both have an EDR, there might be enough technical control changes where one single methodology is not going to work. One command may be blocked while the other is not. Okay. And so now an attacker requires manual intervention to kind of move laterally once they compromise a host and then try to get lateral movement potential. Okay. All right. So in terms of automation, once the actor kind of gets into that initial entry, once they get that initial entry, once they're on their host, there has to be manual intervention. The manual intervention part is where now the attacker has to use whatever skills they have to try to attempt to escalate privileges, try to move laterally, or look for the information that they really want to target. Because just because you get access to one host on a network doesn't really mean much if there are access controls in place to mitigate that, right? Which a lot of organizations are implementing with time. So have I seen a lot of automation from post-intrusion side, Nelson? No, not me, not personally.
That's awesome. So Hector, you've been very generous with your time already. This was amazing. I learned a lot. And it's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Likewise, my friend. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hector and Nelson. Those were certainly some interesting examples.